All right, well, I will kick things off then. Welcome to our webinar on local brownfields grants. We'll just go ahead and dive right in. So today what we're going to talk about is how brownfields grants might be helpful to your redevelopment. So we're going to introduce the different types of grants that we offer, the common types of redevelopments that we contribute to, and what the grants can pay for. We're also going to go over some information that we need from you to successfully compete for a grant. We're going to end with the grant selection factors that'll help you successfully compete for a grant. We're going to provide a copy of the slides to all the attendees afterwards. But before we start, if you have any initial questions, you can put them into the chat, and you can also put those questions in the chat throughout our presentation today. We'll try to answer as we go, but we'll try to also leave some time at the end for question and answers. So we have 4 panelists speaking today. So I am Kristen Lukes. I'm with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, and I am the director of the Brownfields and Redevelopment Office, and DEED administers the Contamination Cleanup and Investigation Grant Program is one of the programs that we're going to be talking about today. So I will turn it over to Marcus. Maybe you should go next.
Sure. Thank you, Kristen. So I'm Marcus Martin. I work at the Metropolitan Council, and I will be talking about a program called the Tax-Based Revitalization Account, or TBRA, today. All right, I'll turn it over to Mike.
All right, Mike Torres with Hennepin County Contaminated Lands Unit. I help administer our Environmental Response Fund, the grant that I will be talking about. Turn it over to Ella.
Yes, hi, I'm Ella Mitchell with Ramsey County Community and Economic Development, and I work on our Environmental Response Fund and Site Assessment grants.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a little distracted. So our goal here today is to help you redevelop contaminated properties. We'll do this by helping to, helping to pay for studies that fill in information gaps and about contaminated properties. And then we are lower redevelopment costs by reimbursing you for the high cost of cleaning up contamination or adding safety systems like vapor mitigation systems or other needs to make sure your site is safe for a new use. And we will fill this information gaps by helping pay for environmental assessments, such as known as a phase 1 environmental assessment that helps you and your community understand the environmental conditions on a property, whether those conditions could be harmful to residents and or workers. The phase 1 helps you discover who may be potentially liable for the contamination found on your property. Properties with a financial viable responsible party are unlikely to be eligible to ask for local grants. So the information gathered in that assessment, that phase 1, before you purchase a property can help you get legal protection for previous or prior contamination. So if the results of the phase 1 assessment show that there's a known or potential contamination on your property, this is sometimes called a recognized environmental condition, or a REC, is what we typically call it. Then working with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, an environmental consultant can create a testing plan to summarize the different types of potential harmful exposures on the property and create a cleanup plan or a response action plan, or if needed.
So we want you to take a look at this vacant block, this picture on the left. This would be a question, right? You take a site like this, is this site a brownfield? The vacant sites often raise the most questions. The questions are things like, what was this site used for before? It doesn't look too worrying, but in this case, lab tests confirmed that there were both petroleum and non-petroleum related contamination in the soil brought to the site. So you can't always see the problems. You need to test for them. If there were waste that were used or buried on the site, you may have a brownfield. Here is a list of common waste that can turn your site into a brownfield if they weren't properly disposed of or they weren't taken care of at the time. So for a fuller list of chemicals or potential chemicals of potential concern, we do have a link there at the bottom of the page, and that link will take you to a list of typical contaminants based on site use and processes. So that's another way that you could kind of think about what type of sites might be a brownfield.
All right, thanks, Marcus. So our state uses a risk-based cleanup system. So knowing how you intend to use the site after it's cleaned up is critical to understanding how much cleanup and how costly it might be. The cleanup could be before you ask the grants.
So we can talk a little bit here about what you can do with an investigation grant. So there are different types of environmental assessment reports and different grant sources that can help pay for them. So these are really, if you don't know much about the contamination that might be on your redevelopment site. So some of these grant programs can help pay for reports such as phase 1 and phase 2 environmental assessments, the cleanup plans known as response action plans or RAPs, and assessments of hazardous building materials like asbestos or lead-based paint. A hazardous materials report is useful if you'll be renovating or converting an existing building as part of your redevelopment. So the entities on the right, these are some organizations that can help pay for site investigation costs. And so we can compare a little bit about the different offerings from these different funders. So as you can see here, and again, we will be sharing this afterwards, so you'll be able to read it more closely on your own time, but there are many different environmental investigation grants that you can choose from. The DEED, so the Department of Economic Development, Employment and Economic Development, there we go. DEED and Metropolitan Council programs do offer a higher grant amount potential per site, but they also have match requirements of 25%. And then the counties, so Ramsey County and Hennepin County, we offer the ability to apply for funds throughout the year. So we both have rolling programs. You can see here that the eligible applicants vary by grantor. So if you're interested in the grants, you should be sure to check to see if your entity or organization type can apply directly to the program, or if you need to find an eligible organization to apply on your behalf. Most of the time, the sites that we fund are privately owned sites with redevelopment potential. So each of these programs pays for similar costs needed to do an environmental assessment. Another difference is that some of the programs allow you to pick your own contractor, while others have a set of pre-qualified contractors that work within a budget and then provide the reports to you as the grantee for free. So starting with these investigation grants, Kristen, could you talk a little bit about what DEED wants applicants to know before choosing to apply to your grant program?
Sure. So kind of as this chart illustrates, DEED has a statewide investigation program. It is a competitive grant, so we score each application against the other investigation grants that would come in during that grant round. Some of the things that we look at are the potential use of the site. It's investigated. We assume that, if cleanup's necessary, that step will be taken and there'll be a subsequent development on the site. So we're going to look at things like jobs and taxes. As mentioned earlier, we do have a 25% match for our investigation grants, and our grants are limited at $50,000 or 75%, whichever is less. We do have up to $500,000 a year. So basically 10 investigation grants that we can give out per year.
And Marcus, how about you?
Sure. The TBRA investigation grant program is very similar to the DEED program that Kristen just described, with one exception. Applicants can request funding for a single site or for multiple additional funding for multiple sites that you already may know what they are, or you may identify them later. But you have to have at least one site that's known or likely been contaminated to show a need for that investigation funding.
All right, and then Mike for Hennepin County.
Yeah, so we have a couple of mechanisms for investigation. You could come in through our ERF program. We don't necessarily have a amount, but they typically range between 12 to 15,000 and up to about 25,000. We do have a separate grantee that administers assessment funding as well, but they're on that 2-year rolling basis for pre-qualified contractors.
Great, yeah, and then Ramsey County, we have a similar program to that second one that Mike described. So we at Ramsey County call ours site assessment grants. There's is the Brownfield gap financing program. Each of them are administered through Minnesota Brownfields. So on Ramsey County side, we have, obviously you have to be in Ramsey County to be eligible. We have $125,000 available per year with a limit of up to $25,000 per grantee per year. Hypothetically, if you get that maximum within 1 year and you still have needs the following year, you could reapply once that 12-month time period has run out. We don't have any match requirements, and we do have rolling applications. So we accept applications throughout the year, pending funding availability. So this is just 1.5 years, almost 2 years into this. So far we've been able to, we haven't run out of funding, but you know, when in doubt, the earlier you can apply that you're ready, probably a little bit better. And there is a set of contractors on the Minnesota Brownfields website that we work with that are kind of pre-approved for this program. And one thing I will mention also that's different about this program is that it is eligible for cities, nonprofits, and emerging developers. So we have a broad availability, but typically like for-profit, larger developers are not a good fit for this program for us. We won't cover the details of the last two sources offered. The MPCA does have some funding, and Dakota County also has funding. Just want to let you know that those are available, and we have contact information, I think, at the end if you're interested in either of those programs.
Yes, so we have a lot of choices for environmental investigation funding. What we want you to know, though, is if you've already completed your investigation and you found out that there is actually significant contamination on your site, then we recommend that you just slow down a bit if you can and call us to see if in your case you would be eligible for a grant. And this got no, so we're now talking about cleanup grants. All of our grant programs can pay for soil cleanups, pre-treating groundwater, or installing soil vapor mitigation systems in new or existing buildings. But if you're looking for help with asbestos removal before demolition or renovation of an existing building, maybe it's a historic building, or one of the conversions of the buildings from, say, office to residential, something like that, then you'll want to focus on either the Metropolitan Council or one of the county programs. Those are the best options for that type of use of the grant. So, Mike, starting with you, what kind of advice do you have for ERF applicants hoping to get a grant for abatement? Anything specific people should think about there?
Yeah, you know, like our slide indicates that it's for housing only.
Okay.
And then, you know, we have a competitive round by round. So, you know, we typically look at affordable components to that abatement. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Ella?
Yeah, I just like to clear. So is that housing that it has to be housing now, or it's housing in the future?
It could be either housing now or housing in the future. So we do have those. We do take a look at it from that standpoint.
Yeah, somewhat similar for Ramsey County. We're not. It's not technically limited to housing, but typically asbestos and lead-based paint, it is affordable housing or is more likely to be funded there. It's definitely a higher priority, or perhaps you know, there have been some unique situations like a childcare center, something like that might also be a good fit for this asbestos or lead-based paint specifically.
So as you can see in the last row of our table, the bottom row, some of the programs can pay for limited amounts of demolition, but only on a case-by-case basis. So if you're hoping to get a grant for demolition, we do suggest that you talk to staff from either DEED or the Metropolitan Council or Ramsey County first, really to make sure that's an eligible use. Sometimes it's a case where we might have to prorate those costs that are associated with the demolition. Really want to tie them to those contamination components. There are also many local environmental cleanup grants you could choose from. Once you have figured out which grants can pay for the activities you need, like we pointed out in the last slide, the next step is matching your redevelopment to the public goals for each program. So let's go over each cleanup program, again, starting with DEED. Kristen?
Yeah, so much like the last slide, we have, all of us have competitive grants, and DEED is looking for projects that are industrial, office, retail. We do housing. I think there's a misperception that we don't do housing. We do multifamily housing. We do like, though, we're DEED, we like our jobs and taxes. So we do like projects that are going to create taxes, jobs, or preferably both. We also look at the site and its state that it's in, and we look at the cleanup plan. And then we also do have a split. We like to spread our money throughout the entire state. So we do have a Metro versus Greater Minnesota split. But what we really, really want are projects that are ready to go. We have a grant round every 6 months, and we would like projects where once we give the funding, that cleanup can begin and that development can occur, giving us those economic benefits that we love.
So looking at that second row, Metropolitan Council TBRA grant programs are looking for projects that either match DEED's goals, so projects that will be adding jobs or taxes, but you can also have a project that's adding affordable housing. So we value projects that commit to a high level of community engagement or will address an environmental justice concern. We are also looking to award at least 25% of the funding to projects outside of Minneapolis or St. Paul. That gives you a sense of some of the priorities for the Metropolitan Council, but you can see that covers a wide range, of projects. So that could be industrial, office, retail, apartments, affordable apartments, all of those could be viable projects for a cleanup grant.
So the Hennepin County Environmental Response Fund, ERF, prioritizes projects that will clean up high levels of contamination soon after receiving the grant, regardless of future use, but also considers the public benefits such as affordable housing, sustainable project attributes, or increased taxes and jobs like our other grants. We don't have any specific geographic priority, but we are looking to fund projects throughout the county. And then we, obviously we have, if you look at our slide here, we prioritize, start time. So project ready is often of high value for our grants. Ella, would you like to talk about Ramsey County's grants?
Yes, yeah. So Ramsey County, we also have similarly the Environmental Response Fund. As you can see, we kind of have symbols that everything's a priority. I would say if we had to choose, affordable housing is definitely at the highest priority for us. But jobs and property taxes are very important. Higher levels of contamination, similarly, the kind of that but-for test, like would this project not be able to move forward if it didn't need this, if it didn't have this cleanup funding. And then location within an environmental justice area of concern, which MPCA defines. They do have a map. I think they just updated somewhat recently with those, so you might check to see if you're part of an EJ area of concern. We also do try to split the funding between the city of St. Paul and suburban Ramsey County. Geographically and tax base wise, we're about 50-50. So we try to do that 50-50, but often we get a lot more applications in St. Paul. So doesn't always happen. And then the timing is a priority. I would say, we're not quite as strict as some of the other funders about it has to start right away, but that definitely is a higher priority. So the readier you are to go, the more likely you are to be funded. And we do want to see the funding go out the door, so it's not kind of sitting around for a while. And then I would also say, I think we'll get into this a little bit later, but we do like to see that our funding is being used to leverage other grant sources. So we do really like to see that you haven't, because especially at Ramsey County, we have a pretty small pool of funding. So we prefer it if you if you are eligible to apply to the other funders, you also apply to them and maybe use our money as match where applicable.
That's a great tip. We'll talk about that in a moment. I do have the PCA program listed here. Is probably in the wrong spot because they really offer investigation only. But I'll just mention that they do have kind of a geographic component to it. The MPCA is encouraging projects that benefit disadvantaged communities, and those could be in environmental justice or EJ areas. And as Ella said, that map has been updated or likely to have been updated. And the MPCA could also provide projects that are looking rather for projects that provide community benefits, that have great community support. They could create green space, or they're in greater Minnesota. So it's really a different type of category of project, maybe more of a gap that some of the other programs don't fill. Last I'll mention is the Dakota County Redevelopment Incentive Grants, or the RIG. That program offers planning, environmental investigation, or project grants. All of those can be used on brownfield sites. The RIG is looking for projects in cities that are supportive of affordable housing and the CDA's mission, and that will have an impact on the local economy, like job growth and taxes, as you saw in that deed example, or they will preserve or enhance the environment. The projects, they are looking for a leverage of $2 for every dollar of redevelopment grant funding, and ready to spend those grants within 12 months. So as you can see, there is a lot of similarity between the grant programs, maybe MPCA excluded, but even when you don't see maybe a primary priority, a similar primary priority, it could be a close second. This is intentional. We want you to apply to more than one program for the same project if you can, just like Ella said earlier. Let's take a look at some examples. Brownfield grants have helped make a variety of redevelopment types feasible. We have funded soil cleanups for apartments, like this example in Hopkins in the photo in the upper left. Soil cleanups and vapor mitigation for industrial buildings. We've also funded asbestos and lead-based paint abatements for other commercial uses, like the renovation of a former factory into a hotel, an event space in Hastings, in that center photo. So these are just some of our examples. We have more examples on our website where you can call us, and maybe we can think of one that's closest to your project, closest to you.
So even though we can usually help fund most redevelopment projects that require a cleanup, there are some cases where projects aren't eligible. So some might be if your site has a business or property owner that contributed to the contamination or caused the contamination, we want to talk to you ahead of time. In some cases, the project just simply isn't eligible, but give us a call before you go through the process of filling out an application. Also, the timing of a RAP approval. So in order to be eligible for many of our programs, you have to have that approved cleanup plan or response action plan from the MPCA. And the timing of that is important. You have to have that approved RAP approval before you can come in for cleanup. But if your RAP is too old, that might cause a problem as well. So we want that to be pretty fresh. The MPCA usually needs about 60 days to approve that RAP before a cleanup deadline. Usually you cannot get any cost reimbursed until after a grant contract is executed. So costs incurred before that grant contract aren't eligible. So again, that timing gets to be important. There are some cases where deed can retroactively look back and pay for costs that have been incurred before you have a signed contract. But we would want to talk to you about that ahead of time. It's based on the timing of that RAP. So don't start your work until you have an approved cleanup plan and you've been awarded a grant and you have a contract in place.
One consideration to that maybe is the matching funds. That would be like the kind of example of a source or part of the grant that maybe has some different timing considerations.
Right.
I will
yeah.
add that, yeah, I'll add that the Metropolitan Council will also look at whether your future project will be either tax exempt or taxable. You can only use TBRA funding on projects that will be paying property taxes on the redevelopment. So we want it to be taxable. The program will also only contribute funding to projects where the total cleanup cost is over 1% of the total development cost. So we're looking over 1% of that TDC. So not necessarily the amount that you request in a grant from us, but that overall, adding everything in there, investigation costs, your mobilization, your cleanup costs, all of those costs together are those over 1%. That's something we'll check for to establish need for your project.
So next, I think we're going to talk about some information that the programs need from you when applying. One of the things that we look at is kind of the redevelopment site. Like I said earlier, what's there now? What are the current conditions on the site? We look at your cleanup needs. The MPCA reviews our applications and kind of helps us with that determination of what your cleanup plan is proposing and the costs for that. We would like your future construction plans. So what are you going to build there? We'd like to see that. Oftentimes you need that as part of your response action plan anyway, because the MPCA looks at your cleanup plan in relationship to what you're going to build there. We also will need the full budget of your cleanup costs and also a schedule of when all the work is going to occur and when your development is going to occur. We're going to expand a little bit on the types of information that goes into the applications and what kind of attachments that you might need.
So whether you apply for a state, a regional, or a county grant, or some combination of the three, you'll need to fill out a form and include a series of attachments. So each program has a somewhat different set of attachments required, but among that list, each program requires some type of resolution of support, complete copies of the environmental investigation reports, that cleanup plan that Chris was talking about, and the associated regulatory approval. Usually that's from the MPCA, Pollution Control Agency. Those cost estimates for the cleanup and the construction of your redevelopment, we want to know both. And figures of the redevelopment, such as site plan and architectural drawings. Kristen, what would you like to point out about the deed forms and attachments in particular? Or is there anything?
Yeah, so I think there's another slide about this, but one thing about the deed form is that you will not find it online. And there is a really good reason for it, and that is just has to do with accessibility of our forms. But you'll have to call us to get a copy of the form. We do have a checklist on our form of all of the attachments that you're going to need. But in addition to the ones that Marcus mentioned, we also have a conflict of interest form that you're going to need to have signed. And also we have a new risk assessment questionnaire that will need to be filled out and attached as well.
So as Kristen mentioned, you have to request the deed form, but there are some online application systems. Before we get into those, what should applicants know about either the Hennepin or Ramsey County application forms for attachments. Are there any attachments that would take some extra time to get or that you'd like to call out? We could start here, Ella or Mike, either one.
Sure, I can go. For Ramsey County, nothing super notable. I would just say, we sometimes tweak the forms a little bit. We did a bigger overhaul of our attachment where we asked kind of the narrative questions about 2 years ago. So if you have an old version of that on file, make sure you're re-downloading the new template from our application portal, just in case there might be some little tweaks. Nothing major and pretty standard other than that.
Mike, anything about the attachments you want to point out?
No, I would say just along the same lines as Ramsey County, we don't typically change our application from round to round, maybe a date or so, but largely it's in the same form that from previous rounds. But get started as soon as it's open. Some of those larger files or some of the completed phase 1, phase 2, some of that work is always good to get those going. And then any city resolution of support documentation also help about project readiness.
So let's turn a little bit to those online systems. 3 out of the 4 programs have an online application. I'll start. The Metropolitan Council uses web grants. So if you haven't applied to the program before, there is a registration here link on the web grants homepage. Once you register, you'll be asked what city or development authority you're working with, so we can link you to the right applicant in our system. And that will help you get started with an application. You can do some of these things before you even have all those forms and attachments and responses. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about the Hennepin supplier portal?
Yeah, the supplier portal is pretty straightforward. You begin with the application process, register your organization with the supplier portal, download the application from the portal. The application will be available starting next Tuesday, the 25th. So the deadline for questions about the RFP is Tuesday, April 22nd, and submittal of the application is May 1st at 4 p.m., I believe.
Ella, do you want to tell us a little bit about Zoom grants?
Yep, Zoom grants also pretty standard. This is how Ramsey County Community and Economic Development, we do all of our solicitations through this system. So if you've applied for other county funding through, our housing development solicitations or critical corridors, anything like that, you probably already have an account. I will mention, I believe that sometimes those, if you have a login, it might be connected to a past organization. So if you work with multiple organizations, kind of keep an eye out for what might be linked there in the default. But if you're having any issues with it, feel free to reach out to me directly. Though often if it's a technical issue, I'll just refer you to the folks at Zoom Grants who can help with those kinds of things. But we should have our materials published on March 15th.
March 15th, okay. I will point out one comment about web grants. Our provider is going to be making some updates to how the application looks. So where things are might move around a little bit. The format is going to look a little different. We're not entirely sure when that's going to happen, but I am hearing that that will be sometime in late March. So if you want to get anything that you get started, I understand it will carry through. So that might be another reason to just get started right away. So we talked a little bit about the forms, the attachments, where you find the attachments, what kinds of information are in the attachments, which attachments. Let's go back and continue talking about some of the major information in the forms that you'll need to gather to apply for a grant. So to better understand the conditions that we are starting with, we're interested in information on those redevelopment site conditions, including things like gross square feet of the site, housing units, if your site is currently residential, if you have a basement or a sub-basement, where the current and formerly demolished buildings might be, if you have that. That's the kind of example shown on the left. Looking to the right, we also want a summary of your cleanup needs. So not only those reports, we want you to summarize them. We want to know about things like whether there's asbestos or lead-based paint, soil remediation, soil vapor mitigation issues. What are those issues? Why are they preventing you from redeveloping your site? As is shown on the right there. To apply for a cleanup grant, so you'll also need those future construction plans. We mentioned those attachments. Those attachments could be site plans, architectural drawings are best. Sometimes floor plans and stacking plans will improve our understanding of your project, particularly if you're having a mix of uses on the site. We also want to see the total investigation and cleanup budget, as well as a summary of the construction costs. So sometimes those are together, sometimes those are separate in the applications. We do have a link to a template online for you to consolidate those cleanup costs, those investigation and cleanup costs, that is. And we want that schedule of your major milestones. So you might be thinking, well, what do you want to know? Well, we want to know when that investigation was completed or will be completed, when the financing you need for construction will be committed, and when you will start your cleanup, and when you expect your project to be open for business. That could be that housing, commercial, whatever it is. So let's turn to the funding.
Between the 4 agencies listed here, we have about $9 million per cycle. We offer our funds twice a year, and that's always May 1st and November 1st, and with the exception of some of the rolling cycles that you heard of earlier. DEED also has some loan money, and I believe Hennepin County does as well, that you can apply for anytime. They're kind of outside of those 2 cycles, but let's kind of dive into how much money we have each cycle. For the upcoming cycle, and typically for our cycles, we offer about $4 million. And again, that is for statewide funding for investigation and cleanup. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, we try to spread our money throughout the state. So our statutory goals are to put at least 35% of our funds outside of the 7-county metro area. We do have that 25% match requirement. Some of that match has to come from an unrestricted source, which is typically like a city's general fund. Oftentimes it's the developer or development team, but part of that match, about 13% of that match, can come from the other funders that you see on the slide. Marcus?
Yeah, the Met Council doesn't have a match for cleanup funding, but it does have that 25% match for investigations. The Metropolitan Council will have about $3 million to offer this spring. We will award a minimum of 25% to suburban locations if we get enough applications in those cities. We split it up into 3 types of grants. Those are investigations on scatter site or single site, as you heard earlier, cleanup, or seed grants. And seed grants can be used for either investigation or cleanup, and don't necessarily have to have a project, but you are limited to specific areas. So we do have an online mapping tool that can help you see if your project is in one of those seed eligible areas. And so if you're interested in those types of grants, but unsure which to choose, we can set up a time to talk about, which of those 3 options would work best.
Yeah, so Hennepin County, we've got about $1 million to $1.5 million per grant round for investigation and cleanup. Like Deed and Council mentioned before, we don't have a match requirement. We're often used in conjunction to satisfy that match for the other grants. So if you're interested in investigation or a nonprofit, you could apply through Minnesota Brownfield. There's also emerging developer component to that. But we don't have any geographic target area, but we just like to fund projects throughout the county.
In Ramsey County, we have about $500,000 available per round in cleanup funding. I will say that that might be trending down a little bit. Getting into the weeds a little bit, but the funding for this comes through a mortgage registry tax, so it's really based on home sales, which because they've been slowing down, we're getting less funding into environmental response funds than a couple of years ago. So could be $300,000 around, $500,000 around, somewhere in that range is kind of what we're aiming for. And then on top of that, we do have our site assessment grants. So those are the investigation grants, and that's kind of a separate pool of money of up to $125,000 per year. And again, we do like to spread the funding around the county. So definitely looking for more suburban applications if you have any in mind.
Kristen, you want to kind of maybe summarize what we've heard here?
Sure. Like I said, we have about $9 million. You should apply for as many grant programs as applicable to your situation. So obviously you probably can't apply to all four unless you're the Surly Project and your site is located both in Hennepin and Ramsey County, but that is a rare occurrence. But yeah, apply to as many grant sources as you can and also apply for what you need.
Yeah, and I might just echo that, I think especially Ramsey County, we do have such a relatively small amount of funding available. And so I think it helps us have more impact on a project when we see our funding is being used as match, for example, for deed. That's often a way that it's done, and it feels like that's really a way to maximize both of our programs. So if you have questions about which collection of grants you should be applying to maximize, please do reach out to us because we can also talk that through.
Right. That is a great point, and that's exactly what I was going to mention. So we all have competitive grants. You saw what our priorities are. A lot of them overlap. That's by design so that you can apply for more than one grant source. The timing is important. It takes us all, for like a May 1st grant round, takes us all about 60 days to kind of go through and review those applications. So during that time, it's important that you collect information because the reviewers might have questions for you or might have questions on your application. Once those awards are made, like I said, it's about 60 days out. Then it takes, anywhere from 2 weeks to, a month and a half to get those grant contracts out. And then, as we mentioned earlier, you won't want to start that work until those grant contracts are signed. As Ella mentioned, we all work together. Our grant dates are at the same time, and that's by design. And as she said, if you're not sure which grant program to apply to, just call us up and schedule a meeting. We're happy to talk to you about that. And we do really try to work together because of that timing and because we're kind of all on that same schedule. We do try to work together. And in some cases, if one grantor doesn't have enough funds to fully fund a project, we can talk to each other and try to maximize the funding to get as many projects fully financed as we can. But again, talk to us in advance. We can kind of help you. We can't tell you who to apply for or how much to apply for each grant program, but we surely can kind of help you to say kind of what's a better fit for your situation. The good news is really about 75% or over get funded from our program. So we try not to turn too many people down. But if you don't get a grant, just know there's another grant round around the corner. I would suggest personally, if your grant was not funded, to talk to the granting agency and, maybe there's some suggestions that they have. Sometimes it's just the luck of the draw since we all score our projects based on whatever other project happens to be in that grant round. It's not uncommon for a project to maybe rank below the funding line in one grant round, and then in the very next grant round, it's one of the top scorers. So you just don't know who you're competing against. But I would suggest if you didn't get funding, to contact the agencies, and maybe there's some ways that you can improve on your application, or maybe it was just the luck of the draw what was in during that grant round. There's no penalty for applying more than once. So if that happens, that's fine. So we're going to next look at some key moments in the grant process. I just love this board game. I just wish I had some dice. I could participate in the game here. But really, you just want to start by identifying the right site for your project. You found your site. I want this piece of property. It's located near all the things I want it to be located near. And then as you learn, you do your due diligence. And as you learn about the environmental history, you may find it was contaminated or might be contaminated. So that could be a good time to think about those investigation grants that we talked about. There also might be some other deadlines to think about while we're kind of on this timing topic. If your site is located in say St. Paul or Minneapolis, or an area that has a lot of redevelopment projects, they might have some deadlines of their own. So even though our deadline might be May 1st, and you might have to get your response action plan to the MPCA at an earlier date, you should contact the city in which your site is located early on in the process to make sure, as you saw in an earlier slide, I don't think we talked a lot about it, but in many cases you have to have a public entity who's sponsoring your application and who applies on your behalf. So talking to the city, county, HRA, EDA, who was ever going to apply for the grant, talk to them early and often. So then you may have finished your environmental investigation and have confirmed that there's contamination there, or the extent and magnitude of that contamination. Then it's time to enroll in the MPCA's VIC program or a similar program at the Department of Ag, or whichever agency is appropriate, just to share with them, give them your phase 1, phase 2 reports. And again, that deadline is about 60 days in advance for this particular grant round. That deadline is February 28th, so it's coming right up here next week. That's the date by which the MPCA can guarantee that your response action plan will be addressed. Sometimes you can, sometimes if they're very familiar with the site, they can do that approval on an earlier time frame, but that is rare, and I would check with them in advance. So if the costs of that cleanup, now that you know what's there and you know the cost of it, if it's not much there or something that the development pro forma can just absorb, go to town, go ahead and clean it up. But if it's not, and in many cases it's not, that's when you'll want to determine what kind of grant money you might be wanting to apply for. So you'll want to start pulling, once you decide you want to apply, you want to start pulling together all those application materials that you're going to need to fill out your application that we talked about before. You might need appraisals for your site. You might need some other kind of assessment information, and then all the other things that we talked about in an earlier slide. And then our cleanup grants are due on May 1 for this upcoming grant round. And then if you get a grant and you're successful, then you could be expecting to, be signing those contracts anytime between probably the beginning of July or sometime in August. So there's still some construction season left for you to start your project before the next grant round.
So as many of you probably know, like development in general, applying for these cleanup grants and investigation grants is a team effort. So it's really best to get the developer, environmental contractor, and any city partners or other public partners working together early in the process. As we've said, the getting in touch with the public entity that might be sponsoring the program, whether it's a city or a development authority, is also important to talk with them early on. As you saw on the last slide, if you're doing any cleanup work below ground, plan on enrolling in a voluntary cleanup program, such as the Voluntary Investigation and Cleanup Program or the Petroleum Brownfield Program at MPCA. And as we've said before, we're all working together too. The funders have intentionally set the same application deadlines. We're all reviewing the project's applications at the same time, and we do share information. If you applied to several sources, we'll share between us. So if you've applied to multiple grant programs and you've ranked highly in throughout our individual evaluation processes, it's really our priority to try to fully fund each of your programs. So this can sometimes result in a shift. So you might have asked for more money from one grantor versus the other. And like Kristen said, maybe based on what other applications we got, we shift costs between us. So I think part of the point there also is that we can't do that if you don't apply to multiple funders. So if you just apply to one program, then it's a little bit more of a yes or no, versus if you apply to multiple funders, then sometimes we are able to kind of shift costs around to get you as much funding as possible, obviously assuming you fit within our program priorities. And then if your request is successful, you'll work with the grantor to sign a grant agreement. If you get a grant from DEED or Met Council, the development team will sign a separate sub-grant agreement with the public grant recipient. So that's usually the city or a development authority, versus with Ramsey County, we typically just work directly with the developers.
So that's a lot of information about kind of our process, but we hope you kind of understood that we really want to work collaboratively with you. That's the end of our kind of most of our presentation, our kind of amounts and summaries about the programs. Maybe we could start to see if there's any questions in the chat.
All right, I don't see any questions in the chat, but must have covered everything, Marcus.
All right. Well, let's, if you do, maybe you could start here with TAB. That's another resource that people sometimes use.
Oh, sure. So just to talk a little bit about the Technical Assistance to Brownfields program, if you haven't heard of it, this is a group out of Kansas State University, and they are contracted with the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. They provide free workshops. They do strategic planning, technical assistance. They can help you look at a site and kind of figure out what the next steps are, what possible developments can occur at the site. So you can just contact them, and yeah, they hold webinars quite frequently. They do strategic planning again, economic feasibility, sustainability analysis. They'll help you identify potential funding sources. They are a contractor of EPA, so we didn't talk about a whole lot about EPA funding today, but they certainly can help you if you wanted to get a grant or assessment dollars directly through EPA. They also, if you are applying to EPA, they'll look over all of your application materials and just make sure that you're providing a sound application to the EPA. So they do education as well. So they just really are a good resource, especially if you're really early on in the process and just aren't sure where to turn. They're a good starting point for that. And then lastly, all of our contact information is on the slides. We can answer any questions today. You can contact us directly. We will be sharing the slides, so you'll have all this information, so don't feel like you have to write it, scramble it down. You can reach out also to the MPCA about their Brownfield's targeted Brownfield Assistance Program that we didn't talk a lot about today. They're out of money, so give them a call first. And you can talk to Minnesota Brownfield's contact for those assessment dollars that they administer for Ramsey and Hennepin County, and their contact person is Heidi. And then the Dakota County programs that we mentioned a little bit today, Maggie is your person to contact at Dakota County. So again, thanks for joining us today, and we'll get you a copy of the slide deck and the recording. And we're also going to send out a frequently asked questions, FAQ kind of matrix that has just kind of a snapshot of these kind of 4 main programs you heard of today, and just kind of all this information condensed into one sheet. So you'll get that as well. So yeah, we look forward to seeing your projects here in May or at a future grant round.
Really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. We hope you learned something new about it, and we hope you have some projects that you can apply this spring.
Great. Thanks, everyone.